Welcome to Hamburgers and Horror, the home of meat, monsters, and magic puzzle boxes. I'm Noah Hook, and today we're looking at 2000's Hellraiser Inferno, where Detective Joseph Thorne accidentally unleashes the Cenobites during a murder investigation. Inferno marks an important and unfortunate turn for the Hellraiser franchise. It's the first of the 6 straight-to-video Hellraiser sequels, which is not a welcoming sign to someone deciding to watch the entire series. It also represents a pretty consistent turn for the franchise, in that most of the continuing sequels were not originally written to be Hellraiser movies. They were basic scripts and screenplays people had laying around, and someone decided Pinhead would fit into the story nicely. It is debated whether or not this applies to Inferno, but a lot argue it does due to the drastically different tone it has from the others. Clive Barker was briefly in negotiations to return as a producer in 1999, but he was ultimately dropped from the production due to creative disagreements with the studio, and was barred from providing any sort of assistance on the film. But they still get to stick his name and his characters in the movie. Don't we fucking love copyright? Dimension chose Scott Derrickson to direct, basically because he was new to the scene and would be cheap. Derrickson has gone on to have a very successful career, working on movies like The Exorcism of Emily Rose, The Day the Earth Stood Still, Sinister 1 and 2, Incompresa, and Doctor Strange. So I've noticed that with these Hellraiser sequels, most of them are being given to young, inexperienced directors who later go on to make some really good movies. The budget for Inferno was roughly $2 million. This small budget actually left some of the crew members like Gary Tunnicliffe taking pay cuts so more could go to the effects. Inferno is generally not beloved. On Rotten Tomatoes it doesn't even have a critic score, but the audience score is at 35, which is just below Bloodline. But as time has passed, there has been more discussion in favor of Inferno and its unique take in the series. It's divisive for sure. People coming in to once again watch Pinhead slaughter civilians will be disappointed. People who just want a lot of Pinhead will be disappointed. He's only in the movie for a few minutes. Inferno doesn't rely on the power of Doug Bradley, which I would argue has been a crutch for the series since Hellbound. Derrickson turned Hellraiser into something new. It's not just horror, it's also a crime noir, a thriller, a mystery. It's by far the most psychological Hellraiser, finally picking up on the promising psychological aspects of the original. I find Inferno to be a breath of surprisingly fresh air for the series, but let's jump in, shall we? We open on our protagonist, Detective Joseph Thorne. Through his own inner dialogue, we learn about how he views the world as he defeats his opponent. We quickly learn he is egocentric and considers himself very logical and a tactician. We also learn he's not a good cop as he snorts some coke in the locker room. Thorne and his partner Tony are called to a crime scene, and it's a familiar one. There is a guy torn to shreds, hooked chains, and a lot of candles. The pile of meat is Jay Cho, who went to the same high school as Thorne. He finds some drugs in a cutout book, and with some close-up magic, he steals it. He also notices a certain box attached to a candle, and that candle happens to have a child's finger in it. Yikes. The evidence is bagged up back at the station, but Thorne steals $300 from Cho's wallet and also takes the lament configuration. Thorne heads home and we briefly meet his wife and daughter. It's clear he spends most of his time away from home despite his love for his daughter, but his feelings for his wife are a bit more questionable. His inner dialogue tells us it is better that he stays with her than leave, so he must do what he needs to in order to stay. What he needs to do is evidently picking up prostitutes. He takes Daphne to a motel, and after using the stolen cocaine they get to business. Very overexposed business. But Thorne is restless and goes to the bathroom with the box. The puzzle proves too challenging and he gives up. I'm just fucking with you, of course he solves the damn thing. But he doesn't immediately get hooked or attacked. He leaves the bathroom and enters his childhood home. He hears a child call for help and continues through the house, where he meets the lovely Wire twins. Aren't they lovely? They start feeling up Thorne and decide they need to get real in there. Ugh, that scene gets me every time. Thorne is actually kind of into it as well, but snaps back into detective mode when he hears the child cry for help again. He runs down the stairs but is greeted by our other new Cenobite, Torso. And just so everyone is clear, this is not the Chatterer. Before Chatterer was killed in Hellbound, he created Torso in his own image, or at least that's what it says on his toy box. But I'm glad they brought the design back. I think he's horrifying. Thorne jumps over the railing to escape and unlocks the door, only to get his head split open by Pinhead. But then Thorne wakes up on the bathroom floor. It seems all this was just a nightmare. He comes out, finds Daphne is okay, and heads to work. At work, one of the forensic scientists tells him that the child whose finger was cut off was alive when it happened. Thorne receives a call at his desk. It's the prostitute Daphne calling from the motel. She asks for help before he hears the sound of her being brutally murdered. Thorne and Tony rush to the motel, where they find Daphne dead in the shower. He tells Tony he was with her last night and asks for his help erasing any evidence of his presence. Tony is much more honest than his shithead partner, but despite some argument ends up helping Thorne, and they say the call came in as an anonymous tip. Thorne thanks Tony by leaving his special pen and an old pack of cigarettes at the scene. Thorne is a fucking dick. They take one more look at the body and they find another child finger. Thorne meets with another forensics guy who is running the fingerprints found on the box through their system. Because Thorne is a super mega mind detective, like his inner monologue tells us, he knows the person will be into body modification because both victims were killed with hooks. He very aggressively has the scientist change the search parameters, which immediately finds a match. That match belongs to Leon, who indeed is into body modification. Thorne goes to talk to him, but as soon as he mentions Cho, he gets rushed. Thorne backs him up with the old badge, though. It turns out Leon had the box before Cho stole it from him. Leon says it isn't him that Cho should worry about, it's his boss, the engineer. Thorne wants to know more about the engineer, but Leon refuses to say anything, but lets him know if he hunts the engineer will hunt him. Thorne sees the Wire twins tattooed on Leon's back, but it's just a hallucination. Thorne meets with his creepy pedophile ice cream serving snitch, Bernie. After buying drugs from Bernie, he brings him inside the truck and beats him until he tells him what he knows about the engineer. Bernie tells Thorne about a guy he knew that worked for the engineer. The guy fell in love with one of his prostitutes and ran away with her. The engineer kidnapped the woman and sent him pieces of her hair and her wedding ring. One day he got home and found her severed head in their bed with a letter from the engineer. Thorne tells Bernie to get in contact with that guy again. At a restaurant, Tony tells Thorne he wants to come clean to the captain about what they did at the motel. Thorne tells Tony he left his pen and cigarettes at the scene and is ready to blackmail him into silence, citing his seniority in the department. Just as a very upset Tony leaves, a child gives Thorne a videotape. He plays it on the restaurant's TV, where everyone in the restaurant can see it. The tape shows Bernie being murdered in his truck with the same hooked lashes from Leon's shop. The killer reveals his Cenobite face as well as another child finger which he leaves in the register. The tape cuts to static, which is all that will play when he tries to show Tony and the captain. The captain is concerned with Thorne's mental state and orders he see their psychologist before he continues any more work on the case. We meet Dr. Paul Gregory, who seems pretty chill. Thorne does a magic trick for him, then realizes he never does magic for his daughter because we're still cementing the fact he's a shithead. Thorne tells the doc he is tired and asks if he can reschedule, which he is permitted. Later that night, Thorne is researching missing kids when he once again hallucinates the engineer. The next morning, Bernie's body is found. The scene is exactly like Thorne described, leaving Tony very suspicious. Bernie's phone has a voicemail from Leon telling him to meet with a Mr. Parmagi at a bar called The Crossing. Thorne and Tony head to The Crossing to find Mr. Parmagi. The Crossing is perhaps the most fascinating set I've ever seen in a Hellraiser movie. The bar is a Western-themed casino and everyone is dressed in their best cowboy garb. Mr. Parmagi introduces himself, and he quickly makes it clear he is familiar with the engineer. He tells Thorne he is already a part of the engineer's game, and finding the child is the object of the game. Thorne once again believes he spots the engineer and chases him into the woods. He loses the engineer, but spots the Wire twins and Torso in the trees before tumbling down a hill. Then out of the fog come two cowboys who beat the shit out of him with lots of high kicks. Inferno has gone full Tarantino. Parmagi returns his gun, but the cowboys disappear before Tony finds Thorne. Tony wants to bring him to the hospital, but he demands to go back to the office. He meets with Dr. Gregory, who is just chilling in his office in the middle of the night, I guess. Not suspicious at all. Thorne tells the doctor he is losing his mind, and asks if he knows anything about the engineer. Dr. Gregory tells Paul about another officer who also became consumed in finding the engineer, until he was driven mad and shot himself. He also knows a good deal about the lament configuration, explaining a bit about it to Thorne. He says that typically when you open the box, the Cenobites immediately take you to hell. but since he is still there, the Cenobites may be as well. The doctor suggests he go home. When Thorn arrives home, his wife and daughter are very concerned with his long absence. Seeing his wounds, she has him lay down, and he is almost asleep when the phone rings. It's Joseph's mother, who lives in a retirement home with Joseph's father. She tells him the engineer is visiting them. He gives his wife a gun and tells her they may be endangered as he rushes out. He arrives at the retirement home where the receptionist says she didn't know the Thorns had a son, once again highlighting how shitty he is. She says they haven't had any visitors today and they never do. He rushes down the hall where the hallucinations really start kicking in. He reaches their room where his mother asks why he never visits, and we see his father is in pretty rough shape. He hears the child cry for help again and heads through a door, which leads back to his childhood home. The door shuts behind him and Thorn is forced to listen as the engineer murders his parents with what sounds like a bone saw. Ooh, they real dead. But then Thorn wakes up in his bed at the same moment his wife answers the phone call from his mom. This time he rushes right over and past the receptionist and guard with his gun drawn. The guard is able to stop him and Thorn identifies himself. This time the situation is different as it seems his parents have disappeared from the building, which is alarming because his father can't walk. That is until the nurse touches the bed and it's soaked with blood. There is a present there for Thorn that has 2 more fingers and a note with an address on it. As he's leaving, he is found by Tony. He tries to explain what happened, but Tony has no interest. He wants Thorn to turn himself in. He believes there are too many coincidences in these murders that circle back to Thorn, so he at the very least is involved. They get in a little cop scuffle and Thorn heads to the address alone. He arrives at the apartment building and finds the room, which is empty aside from a telescope looking out the window. When he looks through, he sees the engineer has tied up Tony and stabs him to death. He shows off another finger and sticks it in Tony's mouth. A phone on the floor rings. It's the engineer and he suggests Thorn go home, which he does. He grabs his shotgun and runs inside. He finds his wife and daughter chained to the Pillar of Souls and exposed to freezing temperatures. Dr. Gregory emerges and shames Thorn for not being here for them. They are just barely alive and also shaming him. He goes to touch his daughter and her frozen arm breaks off. They then crack and shatter into pieces. Gregory shows off another finger and reveals the fingers he is finding are actually his own. Thorn is obviously confused but comes to the conclusion that Gregory is the engineer. Gregory transforms to reveal that he is actually Pinhead. Thorn follows Pinhead to a different room, but it once again takes him to his childhood home. He sees himself as a child as well as his mother and father. We especially get to see how much his mother cared for him. But then the house starts shaking and his childhood self disappears and his parents age rapidly. His mother turns around with her eyes cut out and comes at him with a knife. She cuts him once before he shoots his mom and dad. He is then attacked by Daphne, who he also shoots. Then he is confronted by Tony, who starts throwing cross-shaped knives at him, stabbing him once in the leg. He also shoots Tony. Then he gets pulled into the ice cream truck where Bernie lashes him with the hooks before getting blasted away as well. We see the twins and Torso before he enters another room, which turns into complete darkness like in Stranger Things or Get Out. Thorn sees his childhood self tied to a chair with only 2 fingers left. Then the masked killer emerges, and just before Thorn shoots him, he peels his mask off, revealing himself. Thorn then gets hooked as Pinhead emerges. Pinhead explains that the child represents his spirit, while the engineer represents his flesh. In life, he allowed his flesh to slowly kill his spirit, hurting so many others along the way, but ultimately hurting himself most. His flesh self chops another finger off his spirit, as more hooks latch onto Thorn's face. Pinhead welcomes Thorn to hell as the hooks rip him apart. Thorn then wakes up on the bathroom floor of the motel, really confused, but he actually starts to believe it was all just a nightmare. He finds Daphne still in bed. He arrives at work and chit-chats with Tony and another cop until he receives that phone call from Daphne. Realizing it is all happening over again, Thorn promptly shoots himself, but he simply wakes up on the motel floor again, from which he enters his childhood home, doomed to repeat this cycle forever. And that's Hellraiser Inferno. Just so we're clear, basically all of this movie wasn't real, it was part of Thorn's eternal punishment in hell. I'm pretty sure he was torn apart the moment he opened the box and it just isn't shown. At the very latest, he is killed by Pinhead when he does the head opening thing. so Thorne and Jay Cho are the only real deaths in the movie. So, as I said, I enjoy Inferno. I think it has a lot of similarities to the original while also being very distinctly different. The scale of the movie is much smaller and more personal, which is what made the original Hellraiser so good. We get to see how Joseph ticks. We get to see his good, his bad, there's a lot of bad, and everything in between. Out of all the Hellraiser verse, I feel like I understand him better than anyone, including Kirsty and Julia. This is also the first Hellraiser we get where the stakes aren't incredibly high for the Cenobites. Each sequel tried to up the ante and raise the stakes, where Inferno just shows us a casual day in the life of Pinhead, and I think that is so much more interesting. Torturing this guy to the brink of insanity is normal to Pinhead. Being in complete control is normal to Pinhead. And this is the first movie that feels like it. He's not being outsmarted or overpowered, he is in complete control. This is the first movie to effectively answer the question, what happens when you open the box and go to hell? In the original, you want to know what happened to Frank while he was there, and in Hellbound you get this shitty answer of there are women there that he can't fuck, and that's seemingly it. But Inferno brings us a much scarier, more personal hell to the forefront. This whole movie is Joseph's hell, and I love that. If they threw out 5 more Hellraisers just like this one, where we could just learn about fucked up people and how they are mentally terrorized by the Cenobites, I would eat them up. I don't need the happy ending that all the other ones give me. One of the most consistent critiques that Inferno receives is it doesn't feel like a Hellraiser film, but I don't really agree with that, or the idea that every Hellraiser needs to feel the same. But Inferno definitely has its issues. The revelation that Paul Gregory is the engineer is Pinhead could have been handled better. Pinhead does feel like an afterthought that is shoehorned in. It could have been handled with a bit more finesse. I'm divided on the saloon-themed gambling hall and the following cowboy beatdown scene. Part of me loves just how weird and unexpected it is, but I can see how some would find it too jarring or too silly, although I would love to watch a film just about Mr. Parmaggi. I think the use of CGI is used sparingly and effectively in Inferno. We don't have any of the ridiculous morphing or shitty animated electricity. It's used for smart, small details like the Wire Twins' tongues. The one case where that doesn't apply is when Dr. Gregory reveals himself as Pinhead, which is pretty rough. There isn't as much gore in this one, most of the violence happens off-screen. I'm sure part of that was money related, but I even think that worked to the movie's advantage. Sometimes what we imagine in our heads is hard to top, and the parts that are left to the imagination are exceptionally cruel moments. There is more emphasis on the long-lasting pain, the torture that the Cenobites inflict, and there is still the emphasis on the pleasure aspect of the Cenobites, definitely best displayed by Joseph's encounter with the Wire Twins. And these twins are a million times better than the twins from Bloodline. And I know Torso is just a Chatterer replica, but fuck it. It's a unique design that did not receive a proper goodbye in Hellbound, so I'm all for recycling it if it's done well. So that's about it. Inferno is one of my favorites, which isn't saying much in the grand scheme of the Hellraiser series. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I think most would agree it's better than some of the sequels we have up next. Speaking of, up next is Hellseeker. I'd like to take a moment to congratulate everyone who has either watched all 5 of these reviews or all 5 of these movies. We're at the halfway point, people, and we just passed the good half. As always, I'm Noah Hook, and thanks for watching Hamburgers and Horror. See you next time.